Can you leaders of Africa ever think of the survival of this continent without the need for a Western?
In global politics, the Western playbook has always been predictable. When diplomacy fails, when influence weakens, and when respect is no longer commanded, Washington pulls out the same old weapon: tariffs. They're unleashed like shackles, dressed up in the jargon of modern economics, but carrying the same spirit as colonial contracts. For decades, this tactic has kept African nations in check. But this week, that script met an ending no one in Washington expected. President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso didn't just push back against Donald Trump's sweeping tariff demands. He blocked them outright. He tore through the illusion that Africa is still a continent of passive bystanders in the global economy. The tariffs were not minor threats. They were designed as a hammer against African exporters of gold, textiles, cocoa, cotton, and food staples, sectors that form the backbone of fragile economies. Washington believed a chokehold on these industries would force African leaders into desperate negotiations, begging for carve-outs and exemptions as they had in the past. But this time, things were different. Traoré flipped the table. He declared in no uncertain terms that Burkina Faso would not accept tariff blackmail, and that Africa would not mortgage its dignity for access to an American market built on shifting sands. The response at home was electric. In Ouagadougou, his words were met with cheers that felt more like catharsis than applause. Meanwhile, in Washington, the atmosphere was described as fury bordering on disbelief. For Trump, who thrives on the image of absolute dominance, being defied by a landlocked West African nation of 22 million people was more than an economic setback. It was humiliation. Insiders reported that his advisors scrambled late into the night, weighing sanctions and diplomatic isolation. Yet the assumption that an African state could always be coerced into compliance no longer holds. And here lies the raw shock of the moment. Burkina Faso, often dismissed as peripheral in Western narratives, suddenly became the epicenter of a trade earthquake. Traoré didn't merely reject tariffs. He disrupted the entire chain of assumptions that underpins Western power over Africa. By refusing to bow, he exposed just how fragile those assumptions have become. This wasn't an isolated skirmish. It was a collision between two competing visions of the world. On one side, Washington clings to its familiar role as the arbiter of global commerce, wielding tariffs and sanctions as extensions of foreign policy. On the other, a young African leader stands with fists clenched, declaring that trade will not be used as a whip against sovereign nations. That is why this moment matters. It is not about tariffs themselves, but about what they symbolize: the fading power of a Western order that no longer commands obedience, only resentment. And what truly shocked observers was the speed of Traoré's response. Within 72 hours of Trump's announcement, he had mobilized a coalition of 34 African nations and activated emergency trade agreements that absorbed 95% of the potential economic blow. It was as if the continent had been rehearsing for this very day, waiting for the moment when a Western power would once again test its resolve. When the test came, Africa didn't scatter. It closed ranks. For Washington, the sting was sharper because the defiance came from a country it never considered capable of such resistance. Burkina Faso is not Nigeria with its oil, not South Africa with its industries, not Egypt with its strategic weight. Yet it was this so-called small player that landed a symbolic blow big enough to rattle the West. The message rang far louder than trade statistics. Sovereignty is no longer negotiable, no matter the size of the state. This leaves the world asking, what gives a leader from such an overlooked nation the audacity to confront Washington so directly? And more importantly, who is Ibrahim Traoré, the man bold enough to look a US president in the eye and say no? Traoré's name is now shouted across Africa with admiration and whispered in Western circles with unease. He is young, fiery, and utterly unbothered by the weight of global hierarchies. But to understand his defiance, one must understand his journey. He is not the product of elite Western universities, nor a polished diplomat trained to soften tensions with vague promises. He is a soldier who rose through the ranks of Burkina Faso's military, a man who walked with troops in dust and heat, who saw villages destroyed by insurgent violence, and who learned quickly that foreign partners often arrived with conditions that served themselves more than the people they claimed to help. He came of age in a country rich in resources like gold, but plagued by poverty. And he knew why. When he seized power in 2022, it wasn't just a coup, it was a rupture. He inherited a nation strangled by dependency on France and drained by foreign mining companies that extracted wealth while leaving behind dust. Instead of bowing to the cycle of foreign aid in and resources out, he made sovereignty his governing principle. The West called it radical. His people called it justice. What sets Traoré apart is not only his policies but his posture. He does not speak with the hesitation of leaders who fear Western disapproval. He speaks like a man who owes nothing to anyone but his people. His words cut like blades. Africa will not beg. Africa will not kneel. These are not soundbites for applause. They are declarations of intent. So when Trump's tariffs came, Traoré didn't weigh the political cost of rejection. For him, the cost of obedience would have been far greater. Obedience would mean betraying the very foundation of his rule. At just 36 years old, Traoré is the youngest leader on the continent. His youth unsettles critics who call him reckless. But it also frees him from the fears that paralyze older rulers entangled in Western contracts for decades. He has time, energy, and nothing to lose by breaking away from the old order. His very presence rebukes the narrative that Africa's leaders must either be puppets or fossils. But rhetoric alone does not make a leader. Traoré has backed his defiance with action. He expelled foreign troops who overstayed their welcome. He brought mining assets under state control. He redirected government focus toward self-sufficiency in agriculture and security. These moves not only increased his legitimacy at home but also elevated his reputation across Africa as the face of a new generation, unafraid of confrontation. So when Trump's tariffs hit, the world saw not a desperate gamble, but a man already conditioned to say no, already comfortable charting a lonely path if necessary. And yet it wasn't lonely. His defiance struck a chord precisely because it reflected the frustration of millions across the continent. Africans have watched for decades as leaders caved under pressure, trading sovereignty for short-term relief. Traoré's rejection wasn't just his own, it was the release valve for an entire continent's pent-up demand for dignity. But to fully grasp the weight of this defiance, one must look at what Trump's tariff strategy was meant to achieve, and why it collapsed so quickly. Tariffs have always been Donald Trump's blunt instrument of choice. He used them against China in his first presidency, against Mexico to force migration cooperation, and against Europe as threats on cars and steel. To supporters, tariffs proved his America First resolve. To critics, they were economic extortion disguised as strategy. When he turned that weapon on Africa, the logic was the same: use trade to force compliance. By targeting gold, cocoa, textiles, cotton, and food, Washington sought to corner African states into choosing between economic pain and political submission. But what Trump underestimated is that Africa in 2025 is not Africa in 1985. The continent is no longer trapped in a single pipeline of dependency. Over the past decade, intra-African trade has grown under the African Continental Free Trade Area. External partners have diversified far beyond the West. Trump gambled on Africa having nowhere else to go. That assumption was wrong. Traoré reframed tariffs not as an economic policy but as evidence of Washington's desperation, proof that the so-called guardians of global trade were reduced to bullying tactics. In rejecting them, he flipped the humiliation back on the sender. Trump wanted Africa begging at the door. What he got was Africa slamming it shut. Within 72 hours, gold once bound for the West was redirected to Moscow. Agricultural goods earmarked for U.S. markets found buyers in Asia. Commodity agreements with China absorbed much of the shock. Even Brazil stepped in with agricultural exchanges. Trump had counted on panic. Instead, he triggered improvisation backed by preparation. The irony is sharp. Tariffs only work when the target is isolated. In a multipolar world, isolation is nearly impossible. Trump tried to impose 20th century pressure on 21st century Africa, and the tools shattered in his hands. What stings Washington more than economic failure is the political precedent. Traoré proved it is possible to refuse without collapse, to defy without destruction. And that is the nightmare for Trump. Not the loss of Burkina Faso's trade, but the risk that others, Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, might now ask why they too should bow. Because here's the truth. Symbolism is heavier than economics. Burkina Faso is not among Africa's largest economies. It has no oil like Nigeria, no industrial power like South Africa, no massive population like Egypt. Yet it was Ouagadougou, long dismissed as peripheral, that delivered the first clean rejection of U.S. tariff intimidation. And in geopolitics, perception often outweighs raw numbers. If a so-called small player can stand against America and walk away intact, then the fear that once paralyzed bigger nations begins to crumble. That is why Washington is rattled. The West has relied more on fear than friendship. Fear of sanctions, fear of tariffs, fear of isolation. Traoré punctured that fear. And when fear collapses, the entire architecture of control follows. Now imagine the dominoes. Nigeria demanding oil contracts on its own terms. South Africa leaning fully on BRICS financial channels. Kenya expanding ties with Asia without seeking Washington's approval. Each of these nations has long balanced sovereignty against survival. Traoré's example tips the scale toward sovereignty. And the ripple effect won't stop in Africa. Latin America is watching. Southeast Asia is watching. The message spreading is not that Burkina Faso defeated the United States, but that American leverage is not what it once was, and even the smallest states can maneuver around it if they have the will and the networks. That realization is corrosive to Western power. Once obedience is no longer assumed, every negotiation becomes contested ground. For Africa, this is not just resistance. It is the beginning of rewriting its place in the world. For centuries, the continent was treated as a prize to be divided. Its markets controlled, its leaders lectured. Traoré's rejection of tariffs may seem like a policy dispute, but symbolically it is closer to a declaration of emancipation. It is Africa declaring that it does not merely survive in the margins of global trade. It sets terms, builds alliances, and chooses partners. The White House can threaten, sanction, or bluster. But if the fear is gone, the tools are useless. Each attempt to tighten the grip only reveals how little grip remains. Traoré didn't just block tariffs. He exposed the weakness of a system that relies on compliance it can no longer guarantee. So the final question is this: if Africa no longer fears tariffs, sanctions, and ultimatums, what does the West have left? Because if this moment marks the spark of Africa's new dawn, then for Washington, the nightmare is only just beginning.